Hello everyone. In this video we are going to develop a real effort task app in which subjects see two randomly generated numbers and they have to add them up, and they earn points by entering the correct result. And in doing so, we are also going to learn how to develop oTree experiments that consist of multiple rounds. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to start our terminal, and then we need to navigate into the oTree folder. So we type cd oTree course, and we are going to start a new app with the oTree startup command, and we are going to call this app real effort and numbers. Okay, so now we can refresh here and we see our app folder and go to the init.py. And the first thing that I'm going to do now before I forget it is to delete the results wait page here and here in the page sequence as well. So this is again because this is not a multiplayer experiment and we don't really need wait pages unless we do multiplayer experiments. And another thing that I'm going to do as well is I'm going to add this new app here to our session config just to make sure that I don't forget it later on. And to do that, I'm just going to copy the name here and copy it in here and here. And here I'm going to give it a name where I call it add up to numbers. Okay. So now that we have this out of our way, let's dive into the real effort task itself. And the first thing that we want to do here is we want to go to the constants and we want to modify this thing here to num rounds equals 2. And what are rounds in oTree? So by default we have our different pages here, and we have our page sequence here, and oTree just displays the pages in the sequence, and if we just have one round, then the experiment is over after doing that. But we can set this to 2 rounds, and then what happens is we're going to display these two apps, and then when the results page is over, we're going to start right again with the my page, and we're going to see them again. And if we had 3 rounds, it would do this 3 times and so on. So, and what is to note here, in each round, the subjects can make a new user input. So in each round, the subjects, let's say, enter a number or a result in this case. So if we have an app with 2 rounds, there's going to be 2 different results that the players enter, and when we want to access these results later on, we need to be careful that we use the results from the correct rounds. So now that we have this set up, the next thing we want to do is we want to set a payment per round, and I want to set this to CU and 1 equals, of course, CU1. So this is the payment per round, and I'm just going to set this to a currency here to make sure that this is displayed with a currency attached to it. The next thing that we need to do is we need to go to our players model, and we want to define 2 things here. First of all, we want to define number entered, and that is supposed to be a float field. No, an integer field actually. We are only going to generate whole numbers here, so to make it simpler, we can just use an integer field. And the next thing that we want is we want a new field called sum of numbers, which is going to be models.integer field as well. And this is going to be where we store the actual correct sum of the 2 numbers that we display, so that we can later on check if the subject did the calculation correctly or not. So the next thing that we want to do is we're going to rename our page here, or my page, to the add numbers page. And we're going to define the form model here to be player. And the form fields is going to be number entered. And as you can see, I don't want to add the sum of numbers to the form fields here. And that's because this is going to be the correct sum of the numbers, and that's something that we calculate in the background. The subjects can't decide for themselves what the correct number is. They can only enter a number, which is their attempt to get the correct result. But what the actual correct result is something that we're going to set in the background. And now we're going to define the vars for template function again. So as usual, let's just start with an add static method and then define vars for template. And in our vars for template function, we want to generate 2 random numbers. And to do this, we need to import a Python module. So Python by default has lots of commands that we can use. We can add things, we can do things like rounding numbers and stuff like that. But some things are packaged into separate models because not everyone needs them all the time. And it's easier to have them in a separate model and then only use them if you need them. And you use them by importing them. And in this case, we're going to import the random model. And we should do this up here, actually, right below. So as you can see, we already have this here. This is something that oTree needs all the time, and it just generates this automatically when we start a new app. But we are also going to import the random module here. And the random module is a module that comes by default with Python. So every time you install Python, you will be able to import your random model and you can use it. But there are also other models that do not come with Python. There are extensions that people have developed and made available to the public. And you can install those and then also import them the same way, like you import the random model here. Now let's go to the vars for template function, and we're gonna generate number 1, and this is gonna be random int, random integer, and we want to generate numbers between 1 and 100 in this case. So, and let's have a space here. So this will, the randint function will generate random integer between this and this value. And it includes the bounds, so 1 and 100 are also possible options here. And I'm just going to copy this and change this to number 2. And now, what we need to do is we need to store this correct result somewhere. So we don't necessarily need to store the individual numbers, but we need to store the correct result. And we made this field for this, the sum of numbers field. And to store it in here, we type player dot sum of numbers equals number 1 plus number 2. So you can see we need to type the player dot here because this is not a random variable that we just created here, but this is something we want to assign to the database and to the database model field that we defined here. So now this will be stored, and we can later on in when we download our data, we can see what the correct result was. And we set it here, but as I mentioned before, we don't need to put it in the form fields because we set it in the Python code itself and not by having the user enter it. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to return this thing here. And we need to return the numbers so that we can display them to the subject in the HTML file later on. And we don't want to return the correct result, obviously, because then it would be trivial for the subject to do the calculation if we display the correct result. So we only need these two. And one thing to note here is this function is run every time that the subject presses refresh or opens a new web page. So in a real experiment, we never really want to generate random numbers inside a vars for template function, because in a real experiment, the subject could just see these numbers, see, okay, maybe they are difficult, press refresh, and again and again and again, and maybe at some point they end up with 1 plus 2, and then they say, okay, I can do that, and they enter 3. Because every time they press refresh, a new number is generated. So in a real experiment, we would want to generate those somewhere else and then just access them here. And so you never really want to introduce randomness in a vars for template function. But for now, to keep it simple and to avoid having to define it elsewhere, I'm just going to define it here. And it's not a big deal. I think most of the time subjects will not figure this out and start refreshing your page, but just to be sure, you don't want to do this in an experiment that you send to real subjects. Okay. Now we need to define another function here. So we're going to do our add static method again. Just copy that. And then we define before next page. And what we need to do here is we need to calculate, not calculate, we need to check what the result was that the subject entered. We need to compare to the correct result. And then we are giving them a payoff if they had the correct result. So to do that, we start out with an if. And what are we comparing? We are comparing the sum of numbers here to the number that the subject entered, so to player number entered. So this is just an if statement in Python. And if this is true, then we want to give the subject a payoff. And the payoff is supposed to be player.payoff equals whatever we defined here in the constants and the payment per round if the subject made the correct answer. So this is supposed to be, maybe not name this payment per round, name this payment per correct answer. That makes more sense. Yeah, because they only get the payment if the answer is correct. So player payment, no, player payoff is set to constants payment per correct answer. Okay, that's what we want to do. And I mentioned this in the overview video, but just to repeat it, we never defined this payoff field here in the players class, right? So we have only our number entered and our sum of numbers. This is because this field is defined, the payoff is defined in the background for all oTree experiments, because oTree usually assumes if you run experiments, you probably want to set some payoffs for the subjects, so it just defines this in the background. This also means that you should never define your own field that is called payoff, because it's going to give you a conflict with the field that's defined in the background. So if you need to store, let's say, payoffs from separate parts of the experiment separately, you can make a new field called payoff part 1 or payoff part 2, just never make a new field that you call payoff. Okay, and this is a good point to talk a bit about how these player fields interact with rounds. So this payoff that we set here is specific to this round, right? So every time we type player.something in a page, this will interact with the model that is meant for this round. So if we, for example, set the payoff to 1 here, and then here on our add numbers page, we try to access the payoff again for round 2. We are not going to be able to do this because we're going to have our page here. We're going to have the results. And then once we are back here, we are in a new round. And this is basically all set back to not being set. One thing I just noticed is we also want to rename the page down here. Of course, we renamed this my page to add numbers, and we need to do this down here as well. And there are ways to access payoffs from previous round, but by default, each page interacts with the player model for this specific round. So now we have our results page. And there we don't actually need to do something. All we need to do is we want to display the payoff, and this is stored here in the player, so we don't need to return it here. But we do want to do something else. We want to make a new page, and we call it combined results. I want to add it here. And so, and what we want to do in this page is we want to add up the results from all rounds and then show them combined to the subjects. And here we first of all want to define a new method that we call isDisplayed. But first let's just copy the static method thing here and then define isDisplayed. And we only want to display this page in the last round. It doesn't really make sense to define the combined result from all rounds in any round but the last round. So we're going to define this function, and as you might remember from the overview, if we return true from this function, then a page is displayed in a given round, and if we return false from this function, the page is not displayed. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to compare the round number, which is also always stored in the player model. So again, we never defined a field called round number here, but oTree just assigns the round number to every player in every round. And we want to compare this one with constants.numRounds. This is where we set the number of rounds. So if this comparison, if these are the same, then this is going to be true, and we're going to return true, and the page is displayed. But in round 1, these are not going to be the same. In round 1, the round number is going to be 1, and constants.numRounds is going to be 2. So then this part is going to be false here, and we're going to return false, and this combined results page is not going to be displayed in the last round. Then one more thing that we want to do here is we want to define a VAS4Template. And in here, we are going to access the player from previous rounds. And to do this, we're going to define a new variable called allPlayers. allPlayers. And we're going to use a method that is called player.inAllRounds. That is also always defined in the backward. And what I mean by all players here is not the different participants of the experiment, but as I said, each round has its separate player object. So all these fields here exist separately once per round. And with this player in all rounds function, we can get those separate players into a variable. And we also want to set a combined payoff. And initially this is going to be 0. And now what we want to do is this here is now a list that contains all the different players from each round. And we want to loop through this list with a for loop. In each round, we want to access the payoff field of the player, and we want to add all these payoffs up and add them here to the combined payoff. So we're going to type for, let's call this one temp player in all players here. And what we want to do here is we want to take the combined payoff and we want to add something to it, and to this we can use this shorthand plus equal. This is the same as writing plus, as writing combined payoffs equals combined payoff plus something. So in order to having to first access what we have already in here, then add something and then store it, Python gives us this shorthand plus equal, which basically it just means take whatever we already have here and then just add something new to it. And what do we want to add? We want to add from this temp player here, we want to add the payoff. And yeah, now the only thing we still need to do here is we need to return the combined payoff to the page so that subjects can see it. So we're going to type this. And that's all for the Python side. So now let's go into the pages. First of all, we need to rename this page here. So we're going to right click it, refactor rename, and we need to name it add numbers, because that's how we named it in Python, and this needs to be the same. And now, while it's still empty, let's also just copy it and create a new one for the combined results, which we also need. Okay, so in our add numbers page, let's change the title to please add the numbers. And in here we need to access the numbers, so I'm going to use number 1 underscore plus number 2. Just going to copy this. It's number 2 equals question mark, and let's add a break row in here. So now subject is going to see these two numbers because we return them here in Python from the add numbers page. We return them from the vars for template. In the question, and the form field is automatically going to render the field where they can enter their result. And then the next thing is the combined results page that we need to do. So here we rename the title to results. And here we add your combined payoff. Combined is, and here we need to add the combined payoff variable that we defined. Okay. And then we just copy that because we also have the normal results page that is shown in every round. So let's also just call this result. No, let's call result this round. And in here, let's just I copied the sentence from the combined results page and just change a little bit to your payoff is. And now we need to do player.payoff because we didn't return this from the vars for template here, so we didn't return anything in the vars for template here, but we don't need to because we store it in the player here, and the player is always available. So that's what we need to do here in the combined results. And now we should be able to test our experiment. So let's go down here again and type oTree dev server and open our browser and see if everything works. Now let's test our app by opening a demo session here and click on one of the links. Now we have to do this calculation. So this should be 153, I guess. Let me enter this, and it says my payoff is 1 point, so I guess I got it correct. Now let me just enter a wrong number. Let me just enter 2 here. Now my payoff is 0 points, and here my combined payoff is 1 point because I made one mistake and one correct answer. So everything seems to work the way it should. I hope you enjoyed this video and see you in the next one.